Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 13 of the Learn How to Study Abroad in 30 Days series. In today's video, we are going to be talking about money for study abroad, specifically the different types of financial aid that you may have the ability to get access to for your study abroad semester or longer. Let's go ahead and get started. So for day 13 of our 30-day series, we are talking about money, which is everyone's favorite topic, right? So we're talking about some of the most common types of financial aid of study abroad. So when it comes to thinking about money and study abroad, I know that people start to clench up a little bit when it comes to that topic because most people don't like talking about money, at least openly. But for study abroad, we have to have the conversation because we have already touched on the fact that it can get expensive. And so our main goal here is to ensure that it is most cost effective for you and that you are choosing a program that is not only going to be aligned with your values and what you want to do, but also that is not going to completely break whatever type of budget you have. So we're starting out with scholarships because this is the one that most people look for. I know that online, if you're going through and searching for study abroad money or how to study abroad for free or almost free, that scholarships are the topic that typically come up. So with scholarships, if you're not familiar with scholarships, we'll just quickly talk about them here in the context of what they mean for study abroad. So scholarships are essentially free money. So with scholarships, they can come from a variety of sources. They may come directly from your school or your university. They may come from a foundation. They may come from a nonprofit organization, which is sometimes also a foundation. They may come from individuals. There are a lot of individual people who, depending on the local community that you live in, or they maybe relate to a school, that they like to give scholarships to students for certain reasons. So these are free money, so it means that you don't have to pay them back. You don't have to give them back. In certain instances, they may have stipulations, which we're going to talk about in a second, but it's essentially free money, which is why most students are researching them online and trying to find them for college, for university, and especially for study abroad, since it's something that's much more niche and specialized. So scholarships can be merit-based or need-based. So I always like to make the distinguishment between this because I think that a lot of people, when you start to go through and looking at scholarships, you need to understand what you're actually applying for and whether or not you're qualified for it. So if it's merit-based, it's going to be related to things like your grades or your achievements, or in certain instances, it may not necessarily be for study abroad. It could be if it's sports-based, for example. Maybe you're doing some type of a sports-related study abroad opportunity. There are some out there like that. So it's going to be merit-based in terms of what you can actually do. So you'll find this a lot if you are going to the university level or the college level at undergrad. When you're coming from the high school or secondary level, a lot of students get merit-based scholarships based on what their grade point average was if they're here in the US, or if they got a first if they're in the UK, or if they were able to keep consistency in their academic record. That's a merit-based scholarship. It means that you actually earned that. It was based on something that you worked hard for or you put in a lot of effort towards. Or it could be something, again, if it's related to sports, something like that, where you were putting in the effort along the way and now you're reaping the benefits of that based on your merit. So a lot of students like to go after that if they feel that they are qualified for that. Need-based, on the other hand, is typically going to be based on your financial situation. So there are a lot of need-based scholarships for students who, let's say, come from underfunded colleges and they want to go to grad school. And so a lot of times schools will look at that. I know that, for example, here in the US, we have an entire ecosystem of financial aid, but a lot of what we give out, either it be from the federal government or from our local governments, in terms of scholarships specifically, is need-based. So it may be that your particular family as a whole falls under a certain income bracket and you need to make up the difference. So the scholarship may not fund the entire difference, but you're able to get some of that. For some students studying abroad somewhere, the scholarship may make the entire difference for you based on need. So you'll just want to keep that in mind as you're researching scholarships. I know there's so much information out there about scholarships depending on where you want to go, what you want to do, where you're from, what your background is. There's a lot of different opportunities, but you'll just want to keep that in mind, that with scholarships, there's typically two different types. So you'll just want to make sure that you're reading the fine print on that and make sure that you're qualified, because you don't want to spend a lot of time doing it if you're not qualified for something. That is not the intention of what we're trying to do here. So for schools or for study abroad programs, scholarships are often available. So going back to what we were talking about when we were saying, for example, faculty-led programs, with a lot of those, since they're related directly to your school, whatever types of scholarships you already have, you can just go ahead and apply those to your program. Whereas if you're doing an independent program, for example, with a nonprofit organization, they may have scholarships too. It may not be a full ride, so it may not be where they cover everything, but it still may be enough to get you going and for you to be able to make up the difference on that. So you'll just want to keep in mind that it could come from your school or your study abroad program. Now, the thing about scholarships is that compared to the other types of financial aid that we're going to talk about, they are competitive. So you'll want to keep that in mind, that scholarships can get very competitive because, again, since it is free money and since it is something that is often very prestigious and something that a lot of times you'll see like a press release about, this person got this scholarship or whatever that's going to look like for your particular opportunity, that they can be competitive. So you'll just want to keep that in mind, that a lot of the scholarships that you apply for right off the bat, you may not get. Even if you're perfectly qualified, there may be someone that just edged you out a little bit more. And I know that's really tough to deal with, but we've all been there. Scholarships are very competitive around the world. So grants, in thinking about grants, these are usually free. So it's a little bit similar to scholarship. I like to say they're right next door to each other. However, they often have a lot more stipulations. So you will find grants to be something where you don't have to pay it back, so you don't have to give the money back. But a lot of times, let's say, for example, they may want you to have a certain level of a grade point average or a certain level of academic rigor to show that you're going to be able to follow through and that you're not just going to flake out once you get the grant. So you have to think about it in that terms, that it's not money that you're going to have to be giving back per se. But with a lot of grants, it's contingent on what you're going to be doing academically. So you see this at the university, the college level, where a lot of times grants can be stripped away from people if they are not keeping up with things. Similar to scholarships as well. Some scholarships can be revoked as well, but with grants it's a little bit different because you usually have a governing body, or you may have a foundation who's giving you a grant based on your promise of what you're able to do. But if you're not able to hold up your end of the bargain, then they're not going to be able to continue to support you. And it could be the same thing with study abroad. You could kind of start off on a good fit or show good promise, but maybe you get in the third week of your program and things are not going well and you start to go downhill from there. You may have the opportunity, unfortunately, to lose your grant. I cannot talk today. So you'll definitely just want to keep that in mind, that with grants, you still will want to look at it as, something that is great, because you don't necessarily have to give the money back in terms of paying it back like you would a loan, which we're going to talk about in a minute. However, you will also want to just consider that there are sometimes requirements. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes you get the grant and it's just outright yours, but other times there are different requirements that you have to fulfill. So the trend towards grants is that they tend to be much more need-based than merit-based. So for example, I think that here in the U.S., the Pell Grant is a great example. The Pell Grant is a federally run, so it's run out of Washington, D.C. from our federal government, and it is given to a lot of students who are trying to go to college or university who need a lot of support. So the Pell Grant is something that most people know, even a lot of international students know it here in the U.S., and there are a lot of similar grants around the world from governments. So, and that all grants are not from the government, but I just want to use that as an example, that they tend to be much more need-based, of saying that, again, similar to my example with scholarship need-based, that this particular family falls under these guidelines of needing to make this minimum amount of money. They don't reach that threshold, and so they can get access to this particular grant. So you want to think of it in that way. There are some instances where there are merit-based grants, so you'll want to research those, but most of them tend to fall under the need-based umbrella. They're popular in many specialty fields. So for a lot of you, you may have heard of grants from the more granular scale of, I got this grant to do this special graduate project, or I got this grant to do this research in this area in academia. But even at the lower scale of in high school or secondary school or in college, if you want to study abroad, there are sometimes grants for you to be able to do that if you are in a specialty field. So definitely be on the lookout for those as well during your research. And then just keeping in mind that some government grant aid is available for some students, and that really just depends. And also thinking about the fact too that just because you are going to another country, it doesn't mean that it's going to be available to you. You may have to get the particular government grant from your government. You may not be able to get it from the place where you're trying to go. So you'll want to keep that in mind. Now, with student loans, I think that most people know what this is, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. I know particularly for my American students, most of you, even if you don't have any or maybe you have a little bit, you know exactly what a student loan is, and you know how overwhelming and how controversial it is and how hot of a topic it is. So I won't spend too much time on this. And similarly, maintenance loans, things like that are going to be similar in other countries, you know that repayment is required. So you'll just want to think about how you're going to approach that. What we always like to say is student loan should be the absolute last resort for some people. It can't be helped. And again, there's a little bit of variety. So for example, there are government versus private loans. We have those here in the US. There are other countries around the world that have that. Government loans tend to be a little bit easier to deal with because there's lower interest typically on them. They're a little bit more regulated. Whereas with private loans, if it's coming directly from a bank or an outside entity, sometimes the interest rates on those can be a bit crazy. And you have to keep in mind that when you're paying it back, it's not just going to be the actual base principal, it's going to be the interest rates too. So you'll want to keep that in mind. So as you're going through and thinking about that, definitely consider how much you might need if you need to borrow and what that's going to mean for your future before you put it towards your study abroad journey. Also, I just wanted to point out the fact that for loans specifically, it really depends on whether or not you're going to get access to that money directly. So I know for some students, they'll say, well, if I'm going to a country where I'm going to need to not only pay my tuition, but also need to pay for my housing, and I need to do it through student loans, I'm going to need that money. So for a lot of the private loans in particular, whether they be coming from here in the U.S. or other countries as well. It could be a system where they will cut you a part of the check, but you have to prove that you've actually submitted it to your landlord or whoever you're going to be paying in this instance. So it doesn't mean that you're just going to be getting the money and then just be balling out. We actually have seen a lot of that, unfortunately, in the U.S., particularly in the time period between 2010 and 2014. There wasn't a lot of regulation on the private loans, and so students were actually getting their checks, and I would say a large majority of them were doing the right thing, but there were a lot of students out there just balling out and doing crazy things, and so we've since then been able to rein that in, and there's a lot more of a oversight with these banks, even if it's a private loan, to figure out exactly what you're doing with the money to make sure that it is going through your education. But you just want to keep that in mind, that you may not have access directly to the money. In some ways, that's going to be a good thing. In some ways, it's a bad thing for people. But just think about that in terms of what you're going to need to do. And you'll want to figure out as you are signing on the dotted line what that's going to look like. How are the payments going to come through? Who's going to be paid when? Just so you have all that clear before you jump into this process with student loans. So how to access financial aid for study abroad. So there are a variety of ways to do this. So it really just depends on what your particular goals are, what your situation is. As I said, if you're going through faculty-led programs, that's a great place to start with, is at your school, of figuring out whatever type of financial aid you have right now. Can it be applied towards your program? Or even if you don't have any financial aid, maybe there are scholarships you can go after and your school can help you with that. Similarly, if you're doing an independent nonprofit program, a lot of them will have their own set of scholarships, or they can point you in the right direction. And similar thing for student loans too. They'll be able to kind of tell you, well, this is what students have done in the past. You always want to, particularly once you are getting involved with programs, to figure out what students have done in the past. Programs are going to have data on that. They're not going to give you the specific student's name, obviously, but they will say like, okay, you fit the demographic of this particular student who went to this place during this time. This is what they did. These are the types of scholarships they applied for. So I would say that your program is going to be a great resource for that. Also, as well, just when you're researching online, you can just kind of go through and think about some of the ways that some of the different types of areas for financial aid that are going to be good for you, just kind of knowing what your particular situation is. So make sure that you're doing your due diligence and that you're doing your research. Even if you're looking online at a blog post, make sure that you are, if you hear the name of a scholarship, that you go to a few different websites and check that out, make sure it's legitimate and kind of see what the requirements are to make sure that you qualify. So whether it be scholarships, grants, or student loans, always know that there are lots of opportunities to get money for study abroad, as there are for other opportunities in your education journey. So what you're going to want to do more than anything is just to start early. As soon as you know what programs you're going to want to choose, and you will want to start thinking about what your money situation is going to look like. So definitely begin your research now on that. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you tomorrow for day 14 of the series.